Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm going to take today's video to review and critique an argument that's put forward by the journalist Graham Hancock. But he's made a name for himself for positing this argument that the basic outline of the argument goes something like this. And I'm oversimplifying here, but I'm going to let Hancock speak for himself here in a second. But Hancock's is that there was a civilization which existed prior to the advent of the Neolithic Revolution, roughly 12,000 years ago, and that this civilization had a basic influence on and or helped the civilizations which came after it, and that this kind of goes against the established or current historical understanding of human history. To briefly recap, and I talk about this a little bit in my video that I made recently on Randall Carlson, the established timeline here is that civilization began roughly 12,000 years ago with an event that we call the Neolithic Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution. And that civilization kind of began across the globe. You can see it, for example, in Mesoamerica, Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, Africa, roughly all around the same time, with the adoption of agricultural practices by these various people groups, and that these agricultural practices led to the development of cities. Cities led to development of established systems of government, religion, writing systems, what we would identify as civilization. Civilization just being urbanized living, people, large numbers of people all living in the same spot. And from this, we get everything else, culturally speaking. Hancock's argument is that, so that happens roughly 10,000 BCE. Hancock's argument is that there was a civilization prior to that, which influenced those civilizations that we commonly accept. That all of these diverse civilizations were influenced by this now lost civilization. And specifically in this video, Hancock will be making the claim that this lost civilization most likely originated from or comes from the Americas. He doesn't give a whole lot of detail about where he thinks the civilization was located or any possible sites for the civilization, but anyway, okay, here we go.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
And I have to say, archaeologists like to insult me by calling me a pseudoscientist. I can't think of anything more pseudoscientific than the Clovis First Doctrine, which locked American archaeology for 50 years in a particular framework, which we now know was totally wrong. Nothing good about it at all.
So in the first 20 seconds there, we have a lot to unpack. Hancock is claims to be marginalized by the established archaeological community, which he is, and labeled a pseudoscientist or pseudoscience. So Hancock kind of misuses this word, so I want to offer some clarification of what exactly pseudoscience is, and maybe a little bit of an explanation for why Hancock is placed in that camp. So in the 20th century philosophy of science, there was a really big debate which is called, that centered around this problem, which we call the problem of demarcation. And the problem of demarcation is, how do we distinguish between actual, real, concrete science on the one hand and pseudoscience on the other? Pseudoscience was given this label by a philosopher of science named Karl Popper. And Popper said that Popper saw this issue. So Popper's writing in the early 20th century. And Popper saw this issue when comparing and contrasting what was happening in early 20th century physics with Einstein's theory of relativity, and what was happening in early 20th century branches of other sciences like psychology with Freudian psychoanalysis, or in history with Marxian critiques of historical events. And Popper said he compared and contrasted Einstein and Freud and said, what is it that makes Einsteinian relativity so strong? What is it that makes it so believable, so convincing, scientifically speaking? And by doing this, you can kind of understand the converse of that, what characterizes and what are the common features of pseudoscience. Now, we run into an immediate problem here because the problem of demarcation is specifically what separates science from pseudoscience, but most scholars would also recognize that different fields, different branches of knowledge have different criteria for understanding the subject that they're studying. What I mean by that is that a field like history is not going to have the same criteria as a field like chemistry. There might be some overlap, of course, but historians have a distinctive method that's separate from what we would call the scientific method. But there's still this problem of demarcation. Just wanted to add some, not clarification, because that was probably very confusing, but some qualifications to what I was saying. So Popper said that there's ways to identify pseudoscience. Popper's famous, of course, for his method of falsifiability, that science can be falsified, whereas pseudoscience cannot be falsified. So if you look at something like Einsteinian relativity, the predictions that Einstein made in 1905 were largely based off of a mathematical foundation that he laid for us being able to question basic physical concepts like time dilation, simultaneity, and how we measure things like time. And in his general relativity says that things like light would be impacted by the gravitational force of objects. This wasn't tested and verified until a decade after, in the 1920s, when English scientists like Arthur Eddington were able to experimentally verify the things that Einstein was saying. But Popper's big thing is that Einstein's theory rose or fell with those experimental verifications. The issue with pseudoscience that it cannot be falsified. So consider, for example, pseudoscientific claims like the flat Earth. How would you falsify flat Earth? Well, the issue there is that all of the evidence that's presented, all the evidence that we have points to the opposite conclusion, that the Earth is round. And furthermore, that none of the evidence that can be presented would be accepted by the flat Earth community. They'll reject the existence of satellites or satellite photos. They would say that people that went up to space and that saw a circular globe are lying about it, that there's always a basis to reject the counter evidence. And as a result, there's no way to falsify the idea of the flat Earth itself. This gets a little bit more complicated when we move outside of the realm of science and into the realm of history, but the same basic principle applies. So there is the established historical consensus about certain events. And to the same extent, we can use this within archaeology, although there is a distinct difference between archaeological studies and historical studies. I had a fantastic interview with an archaeologist, Bill Farley. If you would like to reference that, he explains it much better than I can. Within history, there's the established historical consensus about events, which is accepted by historians because of the amount of evidence there is to support that thing or that belief or that quote-unquote theory, although to be clear, history does not have theories in the same way that science has theories. So I'm going to use this word very differently to describe the two. So take any example you want to. Let's talk about the example I like to use because it highlights some of this, is the American Civil War. Explanations for, you have some commonly accepted explanations. These are kind of like big picture, surface level explanations for why the American Civil War occurred, why it happened when it did, and the reasons given by both parties for entering the conflict, and all of the great political and cultural context surrounding all of that. Pseudo-historical, what would classify as pseudo-history, would be something like the lost cause narrative that was put forward by Southerners after the Civil War, which is an alternative explanation for the events. And this alternative explanation for the events hinged on the idea that the principal cause or principal issue for why the Civil War happened was the incursion of Northern troops into the South. So it denies or minimizes the impact of American slavery and the political, economic, cultural issues surrounding American slavery, and says, no, the primary reason why the Civil War happened was because of Northern aggression, is how it's usually said in the South. That's considered pseudo-history because the amount of historical evidence against that narrative is overwhelming. And the reason why the alternative is supported is, you could kind of think of historical arguments like a scale, right? Is something true or false? Well, it depends on the amount of evidence for that claim, or the amount of evidence that can be used to support that position. The other thing that Hancock says here is he mentions the Clovis first theory. Hancock claims that the Clovis first theory was pseudoscientific and that it hindered the progress of contemporary archaeological knowledge. Now, this is also a sort of misuse of the phrase pseudoscientific. Just because a theory has been largely rejected, or just because an alternative theory replaces a theory, doesn't make the previous theory pseudoscientific. So, for example, in the history of science, you see this all the time. Look at the progress, look at the development of physics from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian relativity. Nowadays, there's this understanding that, yes, Newton's laws of motion are valid or still true in some sense, and that we can use these to describe phenomena that we observe in nature. But that the Newtonian framework from understanding of the universe has now been replaced by relativity theory. But no one would say that Newtonian physics is pseudoscientific. It's just been a better explanation has been provided. So now physicists not accept Newton within a certain context and they don't reject Newtonian thought altogether. Again, pseudoscience is kind of separate from that. It's not that archaeologists believe that Clovis first is pseudoscientific, or it's not that historians believe that it's pseudoscientific. It's just that now we're kind of like with what happened with Newtonian relativity. Now we're seeing more and more evidence to suggest that an alternative explanation might be better. Okay, so let's talk about what exactly is Clovis first. The Clovis first theory is an explanation for the development of the first culture that happened in the Americas. And in doing so, it also provides us an explanation for what possibly human migration into the Americas looked like. So the traditional explanation that largely had historical consensus up until the traditional explanation that has been commonly accepted, and for the most part still is in many respects, says that this map's a little sideways, but we have Alaska here. Normally it's kind of turned like this. Is an explanation for when human beings first migrated into the Americas. Now, the dates on this, as we'll see, are hotly contested. I can't say they're hotly contested. There's a lot of debate and discussion amongst archaeologists about when we should label this, for when this event happened. But early humans migrated into the Americas from Asia, modern day Russia, coming up from Southeast Asia. At the far end of the spectrum, some people, I've seen it labeled 50,000 years. Maybe that's a little extreme. I haven't heard a lot of people support that date, but the time range we're looking at, me not being an archaeologist, I'll just be safe and say that from roughly 30,000 years ago to 15,000 years ago is that window of time that we're looking at when human beings first started to migrate into North America. And the common explanation is that they most likely did this via two routes: the ice corridor and or migrating along the coast. Now, when we talk about migration, I have an entire lecture about early human migration. It's easy to think of this as a big group of people, but rather, I think you should rather think of this as we're talking about waves of people. Humans migrate in the same way that other animals migrate. So when I say that, for example, that geese migrate to the south over the winter, I'm not talking about every single goose that's coming down from Canada to the Americas. You're talking about various groups of animals leaving at different times and going to different locations. It's not just a gigantic group of people. Rather, these are large family groups that are most likely, in the case of the overland passage, following large herds of mammals, such as woolly mammoths, or along the coast. Again, the driving factor here is most likely food, looking for new fishing spots, for example, or easily accessible access to mouths of river for fresh water, that sort of thing. So the common idea is that roughly between 30,000 years ago to 15,000 years ago, that human beings migrated along one or two of these paths. And the Clovis first theory says that the first culture which emerged in the Americas was the Clovis culture. So what do I mean by culture? What we mean by culture in the early Americas is very different from what we mean by culture, let's say, in ancient Egypt. So if I were to ask you what are the distinctive features of ancient Egyptian culture, you could talk about a whole host of things. You could talk about Egyptian religion and mythology. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about the gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt. You could talk about Egyptian architecture, the pyramids of Giza, the tombs of the pharaohs, art, visual arts, sculptures. You could even talk about like the common everyday practices of ancient Egyptians. They're like medical or hygiene practices. All of that, and of course, their written language, all of that encompasses, generally, broadly speaking, what we mean when we talk about culture. Well, the issue for the Clovis culture is that we're talking about 30 to 15,000 years ago. We're not talking about an organized civilization. They aren't quite living in cities yet. These are hunters and gatherers. And so when we talk about culture, we're really talking about the physical stuff that they left behind. And the Clovis culture specifically gets its name from the arrowheads and spearheads that they left behind. What it's talking about is the method that they use to create these artifacts. And it's called a culture because the knowledge of how to do this was disseminated throughout the peoples who are arriving in the Americas at this time. It was influential in that way. But here we're kind of talking about the technology and the physical remains of that technology, because we don't have access. We didn't have a system of writing. And they didn't live in largely populated areas, so we don't have access to their housing or evidence about how they lived or any of the architectural stuff that they built, because that wasn't there. All we have are their physical remains left over in the forms of these arrowheads and spearheads. So that's what we mean when we talk about Clovis culture. Now, the debate in archaeology is whether or not Clovis was the first culture to emerge within the Americas. And here we need to distinguish between culture and people. So again, we're talking about waves of people that are moving in. Were they the first culture that appeared in the Americas? Well, the reason why, and this is, by the way, the images I'm showing you are for the Wikipedia page on Clovis culture. It's got some nice pictures. The reason why this is disputed is because there are other archaeological sites in North, Central, and South America which challenge that dating of Clovis. In other words, we have concrete examples of other sites which predate Clovis. And again, these sites include tools that were left behind, and in some cases, settlements that were constructed by these people, which suggest to us, or suggest to archaeologists, that maybe Clovis was not the first group to have appeared. Let's go back to the video to see what else Hancock has to say about Clovis.
Will lead to more attention being focused on the Americas. This is a very neglected area of the world as far as deep and ancient archaeology goes. The recent history of the Americas has been relatively well studied, but the deep and ancient history has not been well studied. And I think America is going to contain revelations for us about our story and about our past. And I'm serious when I suggest that America is the most plausible and the most likely home base for a lost civilization, if you're going to propose a lost civilization.
So this is another aspect of Hancock's argument that bothers me. It doesn't bother me when people are wrong about things, or when people don't know as much about a topic as I do or as other people do, right? I'm a teacher. The part of the purpose of this channel is to educate. So when I critique Hancock, it's not because I think he's ignorant or because I think he has the wrong ideas. I mean, there are some stuff that he says that is loosely correct, and this statement is one of those things, but it's also misleading, perhaps intentionally so. So Hancock says that not a whole lot of attention has been given to the Americas, which, yeah, we need more people investigating and researching these ideas. But to say that it's been intentionally ignored or that there is no one doing this, it seems to suggest to me that Hancock is saying these things to kind of set himself up as like a lead researcher in the field, or that he's doing something that no one else is doing. And within the academic circle, this statement's a little silly. This is the equivalent of me saying something along the line of, no one is researching cancer. Obviously, that's not true. Factually, empirically, it's not true. There were entire research units of universities dedicated to understanding what causes cancer and how we could possibly stop or even cure cancer. The same is true of archaeologists studying ancient Americas. There are entire research departments who are dedicated to this subject. Now, they're not as well funded as cancer research for obvious reasons, right? But that doesn't mean that they don't exist. And so part of me thinks that the reason why Hancock is framing it in this way is to set himself up as some sort of like pioneer in the field, when in fact the opposite is the case. There are archaeologists who have been studying this subject matter specifically for the past 100 years. Okay, everything he's saying here isn't like new or revelatory. I don't know if that's the word. We'll go with it. It's not shocking, right? Graham Hancock's not single-handedly overcoming Clovis first theory. This is an active debate that is happening and has been happening for quite some time. So in the last part of this video, what I wanted to talk about, Hancock will get into a little bit of some comparative religious ideas or cultures that were developing in North America, specifically the Mississippi River Valley civilization and ancient Egypt. So let's get into this.
12,800 years ago. And once we start looking, as I do in America before, at the incredible, deep, in-depth similarities between, for example, the religious system of ancient Egypt and the religious system of the Mississippi Valley, then you realize that you're into a global mystery here, and that the answer to that mystery may not at all be in the old world and may very much be in the Americas. See, it's odd. I mentioned Moundville earlier on. It's kind of odd that we should find what is essentially the ancient Egyptian religion manifesting in the symbolism of Moundville, the ascent to Orion, the transit to the Milky Way, the journey along the Milky Way. These are very specific and idiosyncratic ideas. And what makes it doubly odd is Moundville isn't that old. Moundville, as a site, is about 1,000 years old. Ancient Egypt had already been gone completely from the world for at least 600 years before Moundville was created. The end of ancient Egypt, there's Moundville. And what we're looking at in the foreground is Mound B, and we're looking at Mound A in the distance, and a complete circle of mounds. What is odd about it is we find this system of ancient Egyptian ideas in Moundville 500 years after ancient Egypt has gone from the world. The Romans were the end of ancient Egypt. By 400 AD, ancient Egypt is gone. Moundville doesn't even exist then, but 600 years later, it is created and it manifests the entire set of ancient Egyptian ideas. Clearly, it did not get that as a result of direct transmission from ancient Egypt, unless they were time travelers. The only way I think it could have got it is as a result of a legacy passed down from a much earlier civilization that had influenced and affected many different parts of the world. And the characteristics of that civilization, the shamanistic heart of it.
All right, from there, Hancock's going to go into talk about psychedelics and stuff like that. So, okay, so the claim here is that, and I like this because it's the first, some of the positive evidence that Hancock presents to support his idea. So what he says is that because of the similarities in religious ideas and beliefs of the Mississippi Valley civilization that happened in North America and ancient Egyptian religion, that because there is so much overlap, that it suggests that there is a common source of inspiration. Now, so let's take out the Mississippi River Valley and let's take out ancient Egypt. The idea that one religion can influence another, or that religions share the same common source, this is not an uncommon argument within the context of religious studies. And in fact, historically, we see this happen all the time. Lots of examples to choose from. Consider, the most popular example of this would be the relationship between the major monotheistic religions of the West, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So consider this claim. Judaism and Christianity influenced the rise and the development of Islamic religion. How would we know that that claim is true, or how would we provide evidence for that claim? This would be super straightforward. We take the holy book of Islam, the Quran, and we say, do we see Jewish and Christian influences in this book? Well, as a matter of fact, you do, some very obvious ones, right? So in the Quran, for example, you have direct quotes and passages that are found in the Hebrew Bible. For example, the book of Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve, are in the Quran. Also in Quran is the story of Abraham. So we can say, okay, well, the Quran was written after the book of Genesis, and it incorporates these stories of Adam and Eve and Abraham. Therefore, we can safely conclude that there is Jewish influence on the Quran. The Quran is borrowing from Jewish scriptures. And Islam, of course, sees itself in this light. It sees itself as the continuation of Judaism, Christianity, but I'm not going to get into all that right now. I have a video on Islamic theology if you want to go watch it. And we could do the same thing for Christian influences. Well, does the Quran talk about Jesus? As a matter of fact, it does talk about Jesus, which suggests some influence from Christianity. You could do this with Eastern religions as well. So what is the cultural context of Buddhism? Well, Buddhism derives a lot of its thoughts and ideas from Hinduism. How do we know that? Because they share the same basic cosmology. Buddha talks about concepts such as reincarnation, samsara, life, birth, rebirth, of completely disconnecting from the cycle of all of that. That's taken from Hinduism. And we can make direct parallels between those different and distinct religious traditions. We can also do this through non-textual means. If you look at geographically where these religions developed, you can also trace economic, political, and cultural influences, right? I can tell you, for example, within the history of Islam, that it had its origins in modern Saudi Arabia. Where did Christianity and Judaism have its origins? Modern day Israel. Were there any connections, economic connections, cultural connections between those regions? Of course there were. We can establish through archaeology and through history that those regions had contact and traded with each other. So there's a tangible historical connection that can be drawn between those two. The question is, can we do the same thing with North American religious traditions and Egyptian religious traditions? So let's talk about similarities first. Are there similarities? On a surface level, yes, there are, but not as strong as Hancock's saying. And the reason for these similarities, well, let me unpack this a little bit. So both the Mississippi River Valley civilization and Egyptian religion, the religious traditions that come out of there are what we would call indigenous or primal religions. Indigenous or primal religions are characterized by, the labels I'm going to give here are very broad, general labels that are used in order to help a conversation about these sorts of things. They don't necessarily apply to every single indigenous religion. There's just, bear with me a little bit. So there are some broad similarities, but these similarities, I would argue, and most people would argue, are not due to cultural influence. It's not because they're drawing from the same source, but it's because that primal religions in general have a similar structure. What does that structure look like? Usually we're dealing with polytheistic traditions with multiple different gods and goddesses. These gods and goddesses are typically associated with some natural feature of the world. Take your pick of any indigenous religion, whether it's Native American, Egyptian, African, Chinese, Australian. There's a sky god, there's a god of the ocean if they live near the ocean, and or god of lakes, rivers. There's a god of the mountains if they live near the mountains. There are some common features there in the types of gods that are seen. There's also some common metaphysical assumptions. Most of these religions are animistic. Animistic meaning that the natural world is endowed with the spirit of the creator, or is endowed with a soul, and that human beings are a part of this, I was going to say, circle of life. It just makes me start singing the song from the Lion King, but that's exactly what I'm talking about. Most indigenous religions see themselves and humanity as a part of this larger whole, and that nature and human beings are both inundated with the divine. Most of these religions also center around a particular place. Place is sacred for most indigenous peoples. So certain mountains are sacred because that is their homeland. That's where their people originated. and or that's where their gods reside. You can think of Mount Olympus in Greek mythology. Mount Olympus is sacred because that's where God is. You can even see some parallels here in Judaism with Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is the mountain in which God gives the Jewish people the commandments. The Smoky Mountains near where I'm from are sacred because that's where the Cherokee people believe that they originated from. So there are big picture similarities that you can see between these different indigenous religions. But does that mean that they possibly originate from the same source? No. So what's the explanation then? Why, for example, when you look at ancient Egypt has a god of death. And when you look at, let's say, the Aztecs, that the Aztecs have a god of death. What's the explanation for this? That the Aztecs and ancient Egyptians were drawing from the same source? That is a explanation. Or is the more plausible explanation that the ancient Egyptians and that the Aztecs both experienced death? Right? Same for the for any sky god or god of lightning. Why is it that the ancient Greeks have Zeus and the Norse people have Thor? Is it because there's some theological influence, or was it because they both experienced lightning and were attempting to provide some sort of explanation for it or attribute some sort of divine power to it? Now, to further this point, another major issue with Hancock's claim here is that historical connection I was talking about. There's no reason to believe that ancient Egypt was in contact with North America or vice versa. On top of that, even if you were to say, well, they weren't in contact, but they still shared the same source, the issue here is Hancock's mischaracterization of the Mississippi River Valley civilization's religion in the first place, largely because the Mississippi River Valley civilization didn't have a form of writing. So we don't really know what their religious, we don't know the details of their religious traditions. Hancock makes these claims about the ascent to Orion and the travel through the Milky Way. There's no basis for any of that. What he is basing that information on is his interpretation of certain symbols and certain artifacts that were left behind, and saying that these look the same as Egyptian artifacts. What's the problem with that? It is incredibly subjective. Incredibly subjective. Hopefully that doesn't need much explanation, but if you don't believe me, get a group of people to look at the same work of art. I don't know. Take a group of 15 people down to your local museum and have them look at a painting from Salvador Dali. And then after they look at the painting, have each one explain what they think that painting means. The issue with civilizations that didn't leave behind a writing system is, especially when it comes to religion, the interpretation of those religious artifacts. There's a lot of leeway there. In the case of ancient Egypt, when they depicted a god like Set or Osiris or Isis, we have a mythology behind that to explain what that depiction means. Without that mythology, there's a whole host of interpretations that could come into play. I hope that this video was helpful and or entertaining, hopefully both. If you have any questions for me or any comments, or if you think that I'm fundamentally wrong or mistaken, feel free to leave those in the chat. I'll also link some resources in this video that support what I'm saying. If you are interested, feel free to check those out, and I will see you all next time.